Welcome to Rambam In-Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Ritzeach U'Shmiras Nefesh, Perik Shmini. The Rambam writes as follows: Mitzvos aseh lahafrish ari miklat, shnemer shalish arim tavdalach. There's a positive commandment to designate cities of refuge for a person who commits murder unintentionally through negligence, and there's a mitzvah to designate these cities. So the mitzvah over here is to designate cities, but then if you go back to Perik Hey, it's Halacha Aleph, there it says that there's another mitzvah. Kol ha'herig b'shgaga, geila medina shehareg ba la'ari mikla. Anyone who kills someone unintentionally has to be exiled to the cities of refuge. Well, mitzvahs aseh lahaglaisa, and there's a positive commandment to send him into Golus. In other words, there's a mitzvah on the Bezdin to send him into Golus. Even if he doesn't want to go, there's a mitzvah to send him there. And Chinuch says that the mitzvah is not only on the Bezdin, but it's also on the person who committed the crime as well. The Rambam doesn't mention that, but it could be it's incorporated. It's within the mitzvah of the Bezdin is that the person who commits the murder is obligated to go. At any rate, we have two separate mitzvahs. We have a mitzvah to designate Ari Miklot, and we have a mitzvah to send the murderer to Ari Miklot. So the question is, why do we need two mitzvahs? Shouldn't the mitzvah of designated Ari Miklat incorporate, obviously you're designating the Ari Miklat to facilitate sending the murderer to the Ari Miklat. The question is even stronger. The Reb Sadia Gaon only counts it as one mitzvah, and Rabbi Heschel Perla in his Sefer on the Reb Sadia Gaon's Sefer HaMitzvot, in fact, explains that there's only need for one mitzvah because the Rambam never counts the hachana, the preparation for a mitzvah, as a separate mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to build a sukkah, so we have a sukkah to eat in during the Yantif of Sukkot, but there's only counted as one mitzvah, the mitzvah of sukkah. You don't count the preparation for the mitzvah as a separate mitzvah. Same thing with lulav. You have to take a lulav, you have to put it together. It's not counted as a separate mitzvah. And likewise, other mitzvahs, where you don't count the preparation, but that's included in the mitzvah itself. The Gemara, there's a machlokes between Bavli and Yerushalmi. If you make a bracha on making the sukkah, the halacha is like the Bavli that you don't make a bracha. Why? Because it's not really a mitzvah in and of itself. It's only the preparation for the mitzvah. It's not, and the Rambam paskins like that. And certainly to count it as a separate mitzvah, the Rambam doesn't do that. And yet over here he counts it as a separate mitzvah. Another question. It would seem that before you tell people you have to be sent away to the Ari Miklat, they would first talk about the mitzvah to have Ari Miklat. You can't send someone to Ari Miklat if you don't know that there's such a thing as Ari Miklat. So first the Rambam should have explained that there's a mitzvah to designate Ari Miklat, and then say there's another mitzvah to send the murderer to Ari Miklat. A third question, when the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot, Mitzvah Kuf Pei Beis, where he talks about the mitzvah of designating Ari Miklat, he adds, he says, Shetzivanu lahachen sheish Ari Miklat, kadesha yiyu mechanes lamaki nefesh b'shgaga. So that's the mitzvah. You have to prepare 6 Ari Miklat. They should be ready for someone who killed someone unintentionally. And then he adds, uncharacteristically, going into details of the halacha, which is not his objective in Sefer HaMitzvot, he says, "V'shiyisaken derech aleim v'yashiru eisam." You should prepare a pathway, a road, to get to these cities, and they should be straight roads. That's a detail of the halacha. Why is he mentioning that in Sefer HaMitzvot? Moreover, in Hilchos Ritzeach U'Shmiras Nefesh, before he goes into the halachas, he lists all the mitzvahs of this section. And when he lists the mitzvah tes, lahafrish Ari Miklat, he adds, l'chaven lehem haderech. He doesn't just say to separate Ari Miklat, he says to prepare the path to them. That's a detail. Why is that listed together with the title of this mitzvah? There are many other details he doesn't mention because that's not the place for it. The place for it is in the halachas themselves. When you give the list of mitzvahs, you just want to discuss it in a very concise way. The same thing with the minyan ha-mitzvahs at the beginning of the Sefer of Hayad. The Rambam, when he talks about this mitzvah Kuf Pei Beis, he says lahachin sheish Ari Miklat, to prepare 6 cities of refuge. Shenemar tachin l'cha haderech. He brings the pasuk of preparing the path, as if preparing the path is the definition of the mitzvah. Not just the cities, but the roads to the cities are part of the mitzvah. That's the key to answering the question. The truth is that They're two totally separate mitzvahs. And it's important to look at where the Rambam discusses these two mitzvahs. Going to the Ari Miklat has two primary functions. One function is it's an einish, it's a punishment, and a kapara. They go together because we don't just punish people for the sake of punishment, it's for the purpose of kapara. That's why the Gemara talks about Ari Miklat as kapara. That's one function of Ari Miklat. The second function of Ari Miklat is a communal function where the Bezdin, representing the Jewish people, are responsible to protect and save the life of the person from the avenging relatives who want to kill him because he killed their relative. So there's a mitzvah on the Bezdin to facilitate the saving, the salvation of this murderer. That's a separate, totally separate mitzvah. It's not connected to the mitzvah of the einish or the kapara. That's for the person who committed the crime. It's an einish for him. It's a kapara for him. But this is a mitzvah on Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael has to facilitate protection of its citizens in general, of course. But here specifically, even the murderer, they have to make sure. That's why he emphasizes lahachil lahem haderech. The road has to be a good road because that defines the mitzvah. The mitzvah is there to facilitate his protection. It has a completely different objective. And that's why the Rambam first talks about the mitzvah to go to the Ari Miklat, because that is in the context of his einish and kapara. And then in Perek Ches he talks about the mitzvah to designate Ari Miklat. That's the mitzvah on the community for protection. It has nothing to do with the einish or the kapara. They're two separate mitzvahs, they're two separate objectives.